Hello, I'm Terry Kolath. I'm here today with Professor Adrian Keir. We're speaking about a three-part presentation he's going to do for us on Vietnam, its history and culture. Thank you for joining me, Professor Keir.
It's always a pleasure to be here, Terry.
Well, I enjoyed, maybe enjoyed is not the right word. I watched the Ken Burns series on Vietnam, and I thought how wonderful it would be for us if you would one more time give us your Vietnam history, because you did this in the past and it was so rich and it made things fit into quite a good perspective for us, as you always do, to give us the history, bringing it up to what we know in our lifetime.
Yes, Terry, living in the United States and being an American citizen, and I having lived through the 60s and the Vietnam War, this is not so much history, it's our lives. We lived through that. We saw it every day on the newscasts, and we can't think about Vietnam other than the Vietnam War, and it still goes on today. You know, we have leaders, political leaders, who were captured and are now in the Senate, and it's still alive and well, and the thoughts are there, mostly bad, but many people still alive today went through that war. So we tend to look at Vietnam in that very sort of short 20, 25 years, but if you look at Vietnamese history, which they were occupied one way or another for 1,000 years. And Vietnam doesn't look at the war as the Vietnam War. They call it the Vietnam-America War, because before that there's a Vietnam-China War, Vietnam-French War, then the American War. They just see that colonists and big neighbors have just tried to dominate them for 1,000 years. If you go to Vietnam today, you get a very different perspective than we would think you would get for those people who were in Vietnam during the war period. In that the people of our age will, of course, remember vividly the events of the war and will take positions for or against. Some are very pro, because they worked for the US or they worked for the South Vietnam government, and they weren't, and they still aren't, pro-communist. So there are some people who regret what happened. But then you go to the young people, and the people who are under 25, it's just ancient history. One, they don't know much about it. Two, they don't want to know much about it. And three, they want to sell you jeans. So, you know, their whole focus is to make money. And whether you're American or Chinese or Indian or whatever, that is not important. You are treated as a tourist, and they want to take advantage of that in the nicest possible way. So considering the very high percentage of young people in Vietnam, probably within 30 years, those people who were involved in the 60s would become so tiny in number that they'll just wash away. And the only record will be in American psyche, in our history books. Whereas in Vietnam, it'll just be a thing of the past, along with the French occupation and the Chinese occupation.
Hard to imagine. So why is it, Adrian, that they've been occupied for so long?
Vietnam in the north was its own little mini-state for quite a long time, and in the south was a part of the Champa Empire, which was around at the time of the 1000 AD. We know, for instance, of the Cambodian, the Khmer Empire, and Angkor Wat. They were an Indianization group living in Vietnam, and they've warred with Cambodia. So in the south we have this Middle Ages, early Middle Ages war. In the north you have this independent countries. So you had the two types of Vietnam always. There's always been a North and South Vietnam, interesting, for 1,000 years.
Interesting.
The problem with the north, in Hanoi for instance, that kingdom got washed away with the giant Chinese expansion, and they were invaded and occupied for 1,000 years. Eventually the French moved in. They wanted to develop French Indochina because they'd been kicked out of India by the Brits, and they wanted to create their own empire, so they chose the Southeast Asia, and Vietnam was the first port of call, because they were invited in by the ruler of the north to actually help them in his war, and they stayed, and they took Saigon, which is still called Saigon, by the way, although technically it's Ho Chi Minh City. People who live in Saigon refer to it as Saigon.
Interesting.
And so the French took the whole country, and then they expanded into Laos, and then they expanded into Cambodia, and didn't make it as far as Thailand. It's the only country that wasn't. And that became French Indochina, and then independence movement started to grow, and Ho Chi Minh, and of course then we know about the situation with America being brought in and the threat of communism. The domino, if you remember when in the 60s, the domino concept was frightening us all, that if the North Vietnam communists took over the South, they'd take over Cambodia, then they would take over Malaysia, then they'd take over Australia, and then end the world. So that was the reason why America had to take a stand.
And that's only the first section. Then we come on to session 2, where we go from Ho Chi Minh and the communists to Vietnam today.
Yes.
And the third session is when we're really going to talk about the war and the aftermath of the war.
The main purpose at the end is to show what Vietnam looks like today. In fact, apart from Saigon itself, where you can see the hotels where the American journalist stayed, you can see the palace which the president stayed in, where the famous photograph of the Viet Cong tank pushing down the gates, and the helicopter leaving the American embassy, which, by the way, Americans always want to go and see where that embassy is, and of course it's gone. It was demolished. So that helicopter, the last flight out of Saigon, doesn't exist anymore. So there's just a shopping mall. So it's rather disappointing. But if you really want to get a taste of what it was like to be in Vietnam in the 60s, late 60s, they have preserved the Chi tunnels, which are about an hour, 45 minutes drive out of Saigon downtown. And there they will show you around the tunnels that the Viet Cong used to avoid capture. And they lived, there were probably 10,000 people lived underground. And it is quite remarkable how they could have hospitals underground, schools, and cooking. And I'll show you a photograph, and you would walk right past me. I went down the tunnel, and you were walking within 6 inches of me, and you didn't know I was there. And so they did a very good job at hiding from the American troops. Then you say, well, how can you have a whole series of kitchens and canteens? Surely there'd be smoke. And I will show you a picture of a chimney from one of the underground food preparation areas, and the smoke comes out, but it's so cleverly brought up to the surface and covered in leaves that it just dissipates horizontally. So the helicopters, the United States helicopters flying overhead looking for signs of occupation in the woods, wouldn't see a thing. And that went on from the French occupation all the way through to the American War. And it's rather gruesome seeing these tunnels, but it's also kind of scary because they're very small, and you travel long distance underground, maybe 200 yards, and claustrophobia can actually take a serious effect on you.
Hope you'll join us for all 3 sessions. It begins on Monday, June 4th, and continues for 3 Mondays.